Okay, I am going to be talking about some work we've been doing developing an application for generating text puzzles that can be used to evaluate the reasoning in large language models and potentially also for sort of training and development in the future. So the kind of core idea, the reason this work has come about is that we've seen a re-emergence of discussions of sort of artificial reasoning in artificial intelligence. So in large part, this is because of the fact that the large language models, in their process of learning the statistical structure of text, it's given them kind of an implicit understanding of human reasoning, right? So they've learned patterns of how human beings write text to sort of to lay out a plan or to make an argument for some particular case. And so that's one of the abstractions that it turns out is potentially useful for people deploying these large language models in different ways. So one of the things that we're seeing is that these models can be used as kind of computational engines that are not just a natural language interface. So it's not just that we can give them text-based human language instructions and have them carry out the task or answer a question. It's that they can actually exhibit some kind of more complicated processing using human language to do some form of reasoning. So here's some examples of that. You will have seen that where people are sometimes using the tool calling or sort of action-based LLMs. These models specifically trained to be aware of a set of APIs that are provided in some kind of system prompt, and that they can determine for a given human user query whether one of those APIs, one or more of them, is required, how to fashion a JSON structure in order to make a call to that API and then sort of collate the results together to the final output. So multiple stages, both planning what needs to be done, execution, and then collation. And also with the kind of deep research models we've seen coming out of multiple vendors working on large language models, where these are versions of the models explicitly trained to generate a whole bunch of text before it gets to the final answer, effectively using language as its own kind of internal system for reasoning about what the right answer should be. So both of these instances are similar in the fact that language is being used as a internal method of processing before you get to the final response. But it should also be clear that they're in some sense they're kind of different forms of reasoning. And one of the biggest problems in this space is that reasoning is an overloaded term. So what I mean by that is that we use reasoning to talk about many things that human beings do with their minds when we're solving all kinds of problems, but actually it's hard to sort of pin that down to one specific thing that you can sort of test that a machine can do. So for example, the canonical notion of reasoning is what we might call sort of deductive reasoning, or sort of predicate calculus of the form that logicians and philosophers were doing long before computers existed. And so this is the kind of thing where the kind of artificial intelligence that people were trying to sort of do with languages like Prolog in the good old-fashioned AI days. So you feed it two predicates: all scientists are mammals. Predicate 2, John is a scientist, and that it should be able to draw the conclusion that therefore John is a mammal. So that these are the idea here is, if the predicates are true, there are new statements that we can derive from them and conclude. So this is in some sense what some people mean explicitly when they're talking about reasoning, this kind of predicate calculus. But we also mean more abstract kind of things when we're talking about reasoning. So here's an example. Before I move on, I should just say that one of the interesting things about this type of reasoning is that while language models appear to be very capable of this, there is some evidence that part of them learning to do this is about learning the patterns of how human beings do this. So for example, it's been observed that if you change the order of predicates, sometimes the effectiveness of the models is diminished. So it may be that there's a human language pattern here that's more than just the logical reasoning pattern, and that's what the LLMs have learned. Again, active area of research, hard to know exactly, but there is some evidence that it's that something more than just a sort of a purely abstracted reasoning is going on. Here's another example drawn from Francois Chalet's ARC challenge that's a much more abstract kind of reasoning, which you could call abductive or inductive reasoning, where the idea is the machine or the human who's solving the problem is presented with a small number of input-output examples, and they have to infer the meaning of these abstract blobs and their relationships in order to effectively determine a function that maps from an input to an output. So in this particular instance, it looks like what's happening is you have to infer from context that there are two patterns separated by a grey bar, and that the red output corresponds to the position of the overlapping blue blobs, right? And so this is a very, very different form of reasoning from the purely deductive type of reasoning, but it's the kind of thing that we think of when we talk about human reasoning. And in fact, this is the kind of thing that we're often testing in IQ tests for human beings, right? So this should sort of highlight, aside from the fact that reasoning means many, many different things, there are a variety of different problems we have when we're trying to test reasoning inside artificial systems. So many of the test sets that you might be looking at are sort of variations of existing deduction and numerical puzzles that the machines have been exposed to in the training data sets. And the problem, of course, is that these things have been designed to be hard for human beings, but they're not necessarily hard for models that can read and memorize the entire internet corpus, with that seen many, many examples of the same thing, or maybe even have seen the exact same data points that are in the test set. So there's a problem there, both with the knowledge of what's in the test versus training data set, and versus, like things that are hard for humans are not necessarily hard for machine algorithms, because they learn in a different way. A second thing is that some of the examples of supposed reasoning in models requires the user to actually provide an example of the reasoning. So this is part of the prompt, where you in order to elicit the sort of chain of thought that comes out of the model, you provide an example of what that reasoning should look like. And so you can argue here, it's not really clear if the machine is actually doing the reasoning at all. Is it really that the user solves the reasoning part, sort of showing the abstract structure of the reasoning in another example, and then the machine is simply applying that? So there's a distinction there that also potentially needs to be made. So the argument we're going to make in this paper is that in the design of any system for evaluating reasoning in large language models, in fact any other kind of artificial reasoning system, should have test problems that are really deliberately designed to probe the potential weaknesses of the machine learning architecture, i.e. not just assume that what's hard for, if it can do things that are hard for humans, that it's sort of solved all of the problems of reasoning. We should be trying to actively probe where the boundaries of its reasoning capacities are. So if you think about that, like what's going on with the language models, these are a few things to focus on. Is that aside from the fact that they get a lot of power from being very, very large over-parameterized models trained on enormous amounts of data with incomprehensible amounts of compute, and then effectively learning some very, very sparse representation of the abstract concepts. There are sort of procedural processes that we should be paying attention to. So for the fact, if you're just looking at the GPT models, these are recurrent models. So we're kind of, as they output tokens, they're fed back into themselves. So there's a kind of gradual build-up of the representation. They do, not always, but often they include some kind of positional encoding, because the input is a sequence and it's processed as a sequence, and you do want the model in some sense to be aware of the position of the characters in that one-dimensional sequence, and but most of the representational capacity we expect is coming from the masked multi-headed attention, so that it's got these sort of parallel ways of modifying the semantic vectors that represent the characters or the tokens in the sequence, and being able to do that in parallel is part of how they're able to learn the distinction between things like content and form and many other different phenomenon of text. But the fact that the number of multi-headed attention steps is finite should in some sense place some limitation on the degree of abstraction that the models can do. Right, so we want to be thinking about that kind of limitation to the model when we're thinking about how we design tests. So a couple of principles we're proposing in this particular work is that, first of all, that fact that the models process the text sequentially and modify the representations based on both either the position in the sequence and the sort of surrounding text to be as the context should mean that higher text with higher order structures, like that it has some sort of grid position. It's not just sort of sequential. It's not just one dimensional. It's sort of where it is in relation to the number of new line characters, or where in relation to some characters which are sort of defining some kind of geometric pattern. Those things should be harder for the model to learn because they're not in effect not designed for that task of higher order structure representations beyond the pure sequence. The second principle is that, ultimately, regardless of how many heads there are in that attention mechanism, it's trying to learn a final vector representation of the tokens that captures many, many different sort of nuances of what its potential semantics could be. And that, in effect, it's sort of learning how to generate that based on historical data in all of the training set. So any kind of problem that requires some kind of spontaneous reinterpretation of the tokens as kind of symbolic representations of something else that's not just it's not captured by the pure semantics of previous text, like that you have to sort of view the use of the ASCII characters as representation of in fact, kind of like a drawing, a depiction of a problem should be hard for it to learn. And in addition, text that is self-referential, i.e. it's both communicating a reasoning task and is the subject for that reasoning, should also be more difficult, right? Because it's trying to settle on a single vector representation of each token. But if we're adding if we're overloading the meaning of tokens by making them self-referential, or then we're making the task more difficult. So that's just the two sort of principles we've taken into consideration in our work. And what we want to do is present the first iteration of a command line, a Python library called Enigme, basically that allows you to generate text puzzles for training and evaluation of reasoning language models. And we've set it up to design 3 different types of problems, sort of numeric, sequence, and physics problems. And we've added additional parameters to control the level of complexity. We've kind of overloaded the term dimensionality here because sometimes it specifically refers to the dimensions used in the puzzle design. Sometimes it's just pure complexity of the task. And that we've basically, it's a sort of template-based generation mechanism so that we can have, by taking an overall template and then sort of substituting components from a finite set of possible replacements, there's a kind of permutations-based approach to generating high number of variations. So on the next slide, what we're showing is the current estimate of the number of variations that the library should produce. And we expect that this, as we kind of refine the package, this will go up, because obviously one of the things that we're going to need to be able to reliably evaluate reasoning in these kind of internet age models is you need to be resistant to them just simply memorizing the data set and overfitting on a benchmark. So the package is both, it's an open source code base on GitHub, and you can also be installed from PyPy via pip. Typically, at the moment, it's designed to be invoked as a command line application, but you could use it as a library. But there are functions to sort of randomly generate a puzzle, and then other functions to convert the data structure that represents that puzzle into a text representation. Usage is very straightforward. You simply invoke the Enigme program. The first parameter should be the puzzle class. Is it sort of a numeric sequence of physics? And the second parameter is 1D, 2D, or 3D, this kind of complexity determination. combination. And so here are some examples. And the numeric ones are provided as a block of text that describes some kind of numeric puzzle that must be solved. But these ones are self-referential. What we do is that there will be one or more characters of the text replaced by an arbitrary ASCII character. And so you have to be aware of identify which character has been replaced, identify the identity of the character that's been replaced, and then perform a mathematical operation that shows your awareness of the structure of the text around that replaced character. The sequence puzzles are very, very simple. They're, in some sense, they're the thing that's most similar to a kind of standard IQ test, where we present a number of patterns built out of ASCII characters, where there's some kind of simple transformation from as you progress through the sequence, and you basically have to use some form of abductive reasoning to identify the simplest possible transformation that could be responsible for those changes, and then infer the missing pattern. And then the physics puzzles are a kind of extension of that sequence idea, but we include the requirement that you might have to identify things like the notion of momentum or acceleration, deceleration, or potentially sort of rebounding of boundaries. So it's basically, the idea here is abductive reasoning, but with a kind of bias towards assuming that the world has simple Newtonian physics kind of elements. So this is the kind of reasoning that we might expect a model that had to deal with arbitrary situations in the real physical world would have to be capable of. So the summary is I've talked a lot about mostly the kind of design principles in thinking about how we evaluate reasoning, particularly in language models in the face of the sort of current developments in AI research. We've developed a package for generating purely text-based puzzles to probe different kinds of reasoning under those design principles we discussed. Some of them are self-referential, some of them are sort of have different orders of dimensionality in the puzzles. We're sort of reusing the ASCII characters both as descriptions of the puzzle, but also to sort of as sort of geometric or pictorial representations of a puzzle that needs to be solved. So there has to be some sort of, the models will require some sort of awareness of the spatial arrangement of characters, and basically be able to sort of interpret characters as symbolic representations of something beyond their sort of normal literal meaning that the models might have learned from reading the entire internet. So our hope is that all of this will be useful for people probing and working on text-based artificial intelligence systems. And we're looking forward to hearing a lot of feedback from people on this. So the next stage in the research is obviously to apply this to a large number of different language models and kind of benchmark them and talk about what we've learned, and then use that to improve the package to make it, perhaps expand the number of types of puzzles or the number of sort of variations to make it more robust and more informative for researchers looking to make use of it. Again, here are some links where you can get in contact with me or see other projects I'm working on, and I am happy to take your questions.